All right, welcome back, and continuing on this discussion on nutrition. And I forgot to mention this in the other lectures. If you really want to get more into nutrition, I highly recommend Dr. Joanne Murray's Equine Nutrition course through Coursera. It's a wonderful, 5-week course that delves in more deeper into equine nutrition and their digestive anatomy. So if you really want to learn more, I highly recommend you sign up, and there should be another offering here in the near future. Now, in this discussion, we're going to kind of talk about what makes up the diet of the horse and really the components of the feedstuffs. So just as a review, it's always good to review, how much we feed the horse. Again, like I've said throughout, we're going to constantly remind you on this, that we base how much we feed on the weight of the animal, and that's anywhere from 2.5% to 3% per day. And we really base our diets off forage and then go from there. So we'll kind of talk about each component, and the first one obviously is the forage. And this can be in the form of pasture or hay. And in the next lecture, we're going to really get deeper into pasture management. But pasture can be the only source of forage for these animals, and it's actually excellent source of forage. Now the other next component is some sort of concentrate or grain. Now again, especially for these horses on these maintenance diets, you don't always have to provide grain or concentrate. Don't think you have to. And the reason we do provide this in the diet is because we're asking these animals to do things that they normally don't do. They're going to go riding, they're going to go jumping, they're going to go dancing, dressage, those types of things. And those increase the caloric requirements and the protein requirements and other nutrients. So that's why we introduce grain and concentrate. Now, I will say this, and this will get into some health management too. It may be worthwhile to even on a horse on a maintenance diet that should be purely forage, it may be a good idea to give them a little bit of grain twice a day, or at least once a day, but if you could twice a day, to have them come up and you can inspect them daily and see them daily and interact with them daily. So it's a good management tip or tool to use. Now, the other things that we may add to the diet could be some supplements. And this is if we have any nutritional deficiencies, which we're going to get more into, with deficient soils, or if you're not meeting certain nutrient requirements through forage and concentrate or forage and grain, then you would introduce some supplements to allow that animal to meet their requirements. And then I always say, and I always tell my students, water is the most important nutrient. We cannot leave water out. It is the most important because without it, the horses would perish really quickly. So we can always, even for us, we could live weeks, without food, but without water, we would be dead within a few days. Same thing holds true for the equids. So water is the most important thing that you can provide to them on a day-to-day basis. Now we're going to jump into these a little bit deeper, and just to start going back to forage, how forage differs from the other parts of the diet is they're higher in fiber, lower in energy than, say, your grains or your concentrates. So that plant fiber is not normally digested in the small intestine. The horse doesn't have natural enzymes to break down that plant fiber. So that plant fiber is passed on to the hindgut, where it's broken down by those billions of microbes that break down the fiber in the hindgut, and then provides additional nutrients to the horse. Now, it is, again, we'll go into pasture management in the next lecture much deeper, but a well-maintained pasture can meet the horse's daily forage requirement, or the donkeys or the other mules, hybrids, what have you. So your pastures the horse will regulate and will meet their daily forage requirements just with the pasture, but if you are providing hay, the minimum requirement, the absolute minimum requirement, is 1% body weight per day. So if you're basing your diet and you have to give more of a concentrate or grain with higher energy, always remember you need at least 1% total body weight of forage, and that's really to help maintain digestive health, gut health. So in our example here, a 1,000-pound or 450-kilogram horse, that's 10 pounds of hay a day, or 4.5 kilograms. Now ideally, we would provide more forage, and if you had a horse just on a maintenance diet, a 3% body weight per day, that's 30 pounds of hay, or 13.5 kilograms. Now, what types of hays? There's many hays throughout the world. So we break this down into two types. There's the grass hays and then the legume hays. So your grass hays, there could be anything from like Timothy grass, Bermuda grass, orchard grass, ryegrass, and there's probably some others throughout the world. So, you know, these are grass-based hays. And then the legumes, these are just different types of plants. Their plant structure is different. And the legumes, it's important to remember, are generally more nutritious than our grass hays. They have more energy, more protein, and some other nutrients. So, you know, it's always remember, sometimes you'll hear someone say called a hot hay, and that just means there's more energy in it compared to a grass hay. So some of our legume hays are alfalfas and the different types of clovers you see listed there. Now, switching gears to the concentrates or grains, how these differ is they're higher in energy and then lower in fiber than your forages. So if we looked at a list of just some common feedstuffs that we give horses, if you see here the percent crude fiber right here, percent CF, and then here's our concentrates, and then going down to our hays, you can see the fiber increases as we get into the hays. But then you can see the digestible energy is a lot lower with those fibrous feeds and actually goes up in those grains. So that's how they differ pretty sharply between the two. Now, protein is very important in a diet, and if you increase the protein in a horse's diet, you're actually increasing the energy. It's just the way those amino acids are broken down. Now, I added this picture here because you'll see the percentages, and most commercial feeds, people will call them by their percentages. Oh, that's a 10% horse feed, or that's a 14% horse feed. Well, what that is referring to is the amount of crude protein in that feed. So you see it as CP, and that's the percentages that you typically see with most commercial feeds. So, you know, a 12% horse feed is going to be 12% crude protein. Now, if you looked at those ingredients again that we showed you with the fiber and the digestible energy, you can see typically your concentrates or your grains don't have as much protein as, say, your legume hays. Now, our grass hays typically aren't super high in protein, and then you see this one right here, soybean meal, has the highest crude protein of any type of concentrate. Now, soybean meal is typically used in your commercial feeds to balance the protein in that feed. So soybeans are actually very, very important in providing protein in our own diet. Now, just to kind of show you, to give you some comparisons, if we go back to nutrient requirements, and this is the nutrient requirements of a 500 kilogram horse or 1,100 pounds, and you can see the different stages that we've talked about. So in a maintenance, their energy requirements and protein requirements are pretty low. So, you know, you can meet those requirements with your, you know, grass hays. But you can see at different stages of life, you know, especially our weanlings, have really high protein, really high energy requirements. So we need to find some balance, you know, with our grass hays and our concentrates until we can find the right balance to meet those requirements. Now, jumping into some of the supplements, certain supplements most people might feed, vitamin mineral mixes are probably the most popular because, you know, basically what they're doing is ensuring that animal meets its mineral and vitamin requirements. I will say this, with minerals, you have to be careful because you can overdo it with minerals and get, you know, what we call mineral toxicity with these animals. So always be careful when you're adding minerals to follow directions and appropriately give an animal the minerals. But, you know, especially with forage, minerals are really important because a lot of our forages are dependent, their mineral content is dependent on the soil. And for example, you know, in the United States, you can see there in this image that there are many parts of the Americas that are deficient in selenium in the soil. So that means there's not as much selenium in the forage. And if we're feeding a forage-based or a, you know, wherever that forage is grown or a pasture, you know, they could not be meeting their selenium requirement. Likewise, in other parts of the world, like in India, there's nitrogen and zinc poor soils. So in that part of the world, they would maybe have to, augment their diets with some more nitrogen or zinc to make sure, our animals are meeting their requirements. Now with the vitamins, generally you don't need to provide extra vitamins. They're with a well-balanced diet, the vitamins are in there. They're getting vitamin A from the forage, vitamin D from being out in the sunshine, hitting their coats. That's helping produce vitamin D. B vitamins produced in the hindgut. Where you may see people supplementing is with your exercise horses. You may give them some vitamin C and E, and that's really for what we call oxidation or antioxidants that actually help through the recovery phase, and those animals might have sweat some of those out, so you would feed that. Now, the next type of supplement that I always like to talk about is fat, and I know I've kind of already talked a little bit more, and we'll continue with this story, that fat is being recommended more and more in equine diets because they do so well on it, and they tolerate it so well. We're getting away from feeding these carbohydrate, simple sugar-rich diets because we're seeing a higher incidence of either overweight or obesity with these animals, and then also insulin resistance, which is very similar to type 2 diabetes in humans. So fat is an actual, excellent source of calories for the horses or your other equids. And it could be fed up to 10% of the total diet. So if I'm feeding 30 pounds per day, 3 pounds can actually be fat. Now, sources of fat that you would feed, especially to a lot of people, is you can feed simple vegetable fat that you get or vegetable oil you get from your local food store. As long as it's human quality food oil, you can actually do what we call top dressing. And that's what this is going on right here, is they're just pouring it on top of the feed, mix it in, and feed it to their animals. And I've seen horses devour this. They really do like it. And in my experience, when I came across an animal that was in a 2.5 body condition, almost 3, 2.5, 3. I talked to the owner, put him on a high-fat diet, started feeding him vegetable oil. Within a month, that horse almost gained a full body condition, and within 2 months, it was almost up to a 5. So it safely added weight to the animal. So this is how you would safely increase weight, just increase their fat content in their diet, and horses tend to digest it really well. Now, getting back to water, again, the most important nutrient. On average, horses need about 8 to 12 gallons per day, or 30 to 45 liters. Now, obviously, different things are going to affect that. So, hotter portions of the year, especially here in Florida during the summer months when it's really hot and muggy, those horses might drink upwards of 20 gallons plus per day. Or during the winter when it's a lot cooler, they may not drink quite 10 gallons of water per day. So it's good to monitor their water intake and ensure they have enough water during that. Things like exercise is going to increase, their water intake. And then dry matter. If they eat a drier hay, they're going to salivate more, they're going to want to drink more. If they're eating more lush forage, which has more moisture content in it, they may drink less. And then pregnancy lactation, again, is going to increase water intake. Now, finally, in this slide set, and I kind of felt it fit in here, was the special class of geriatric horses. And then I also think this table is pretty neat. So this table is comparing horse to human years, and there's a ratio next to it. So you can see with horses, especially younger horses, this is the highest ratio. And horses, or the donkeys or mules or other hybrids, they grow really quickly, in comparison to us. So you can see a 10-year-old horse is almost 30 to 40 years in our age. So a 4-to-1 ratio. Now these geriatric horses, once they get 20 plus, their nutrient requirements are going to start shifting. So that's where we're going to start, supplementing their diets and changing things up. So again, one of the recommendations for feeding geriatric horses is to feed more fat because their metabolisms aren't as efficient, so they're going to need more energy in the diet because they're not digesting their food as well as a young horse. And their protein requirements are going to go up a little bit because, again, that metabolism is not as efficient, so it could get up to the 14% range. And you can meet some of this by, kind of feeding a grass, alfalfa, hay mix, a legume, grass, hay mix. You have to be careful sometimes feeding geriatric horses too much legume hay because it can stress the kidneys a little bit with nitrogen content and whatnot. So, you do want to make sure they're eating some grass hays mixed in with some legume hay. Less energy dense grains, and I always like to tell students and owners, oats are always a good option for horses, whole oats. They're very high in fiber. They're not quite as energy dense as, say, corn, so oats are always a good option if you can get them. And those are just some considerations for your geriatric type horses. So in the next lecture, we're going to kind of jump into pasture management and how we manage, putting animals on pasture. So I'll look to see you then.